Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST panel discussion session, Impact of COP26 on the food sector, which has been organised by IFST's Sustainability Group. My name is Gavin Milligan and I chair the Sustainability Steering Group. I've got over 25 years experience in the food sector in a variety of operational roles up to board level, and I've worked in manufacturing, retail and food service. These days, I operate as a consultant, helping businesses and other types of organisation incorporate environmental, social and governance, ESG issues into their overall organisational strategies. I also sit on several commercial and academic management boards. Now, this webinar was conceived to provide IFST members with expert insights into the implications of COP26, the 26th Conference of the Parties on the Environment, for our sector. The global society strives for ways to keep global temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we are rapidly running out of room for manoeuvre. IFST has assembled a really impressive panel covering the full value chain from agriculture all the way through to consumer, augmented by some policy specialists, and you can see the contributors there on the screen in front of you. I'll give quick introductions to each of the panelists in turn. You can find fuller biographies in the event details online. Also, we have an audience question which we'll poll before each speaker gives their full views on the next topic. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded into IFST's webinar hub. To submit a question for our panel in the session today, you can use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen, all being well. And as well as asking your own questions, you can also respond to questions asked by other participants by upvoting their questions, clicking the like button next to questions on the list. So our speakers today are Judith Batula, who is a former director of Sainsbury's brand and has worked in the food and drink industry for over 35 years, starting in manufacturing before moving to retail. And from 2004 until earlier this year, was director of Sainsbury's brand. A biochemist and nutritionist by training, Judith also has an honorary degree, doctorate in agriculture from Harper Adams University. From 2013 to 2018, she chaired the government's Agri-Tech Council and amongst other posts is a non-exec director at the Environment Agency. Dr. Christian Reynolds is a senior lecturer in the Centre for Food Policy at City University and a global expert on food loss and waste and sustainable diets. He has worked on these issues around the world and has also co-authored over 50 peer-reviewed publications, as well as multiple reports and book chapters. Christian also researches sustainable cookery, food history, and the political power of food in international relations, and is the principal investigator of several high-profile projects. Dr. Lucy Foster is Joint Agri-Food Science Lead, the Agri-Food Chain Directorate at DEFRA, and began her government career as a scientist at MAF, working on food labelling and standards, moving on to the FSA in 2000, DEFRA in 2009, where she's responsible for a broad portfolio of strategic research, evidence and analysis underpinning agriculture and food policy. Food scientist by training with research experience at both Unilever and IFR in Norwich. Andrew Kike, CBE, is Director General of the Provision Trade Federation, the PTF, which represents processors and traders in a range of staple dairy, meat and fishery products, which together account for around 20% of UK household expenditure on food. Andrew was previously Director of Sustainability at the Food and Drink Federation, prior to which he was a career civil servant working on agri-food, trade and the environment. He's got extensive experience at senior level in EU and international negotiations. And then finally, but by no means least, we have Tom Clark, a working farmer who sits on the NFU's Net Zero Steering Committee. Tom farms 1,000 acres of arable crops in the Cambridgeshire Fens near Ely, and only came into the family business in his mid-30s following a wide-ranging career. He brings an unorthodox and objective mindset to tackling the challenges and opportunities of food production and environmental stewardship. He is known for his thought-provoking articles in the farming press and for effectively highlighting farming issues on social media. So that's our panel. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is the audience poll. And we thought we'd put it up first so that each of our speakers has an opportunity to understand your collective perspective on how successful you believe COP26 was. So please pick one of those 5 responses that you can see on the screen in front of you. We'll give you about 30 seconds, and then we'll see what the results of the poll tell us. Okay, well, that's better than it might have been. I suppose it would be unlikely if anybody rated it a success, at least on the basis of the coverage that we've seen. But 50% of respondents finding it a cause for optimism is something. Okay, so thank you all for your contributions there. And we will go straight into the panelists' contributions. Each of them is going to give their view of COP26, and then we'll go into the Q&A session. So first up, we have Judith Batula.
Thank you, Gavin, and good morning, everybody, wherever you are. Well, I say good morning, it might not be good morning, but wherever you are, and thank you for inviting me along. I had the privilege of spending 9 days at COP26 this year, and I've got really 5 things that I wanted to share with you to set the thinking and perhaps provoke some questions from you. And the first one really was the presence of our sector, and by our sector I mean agriculture and food, right from first principles of soil health all the way through to how consumers make more informed choices. And I think it would be fair to say that there wasn't a great presence, which was disappointing, and disappointing really because the facts are that almost a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system in its entirety. We know that we waste a lot of that food, so that's greenhouse gas emissions and precious resources that have virtually been written off and lost to the system. And I find it really difficult when everyone talks about agriculture and food production being the biggest cause of nature loss and biodiversity loss, that again, our system wasn't well represented at the conference. So that's the first point. I think it's coming, by the way, so that's the cause for optimism, because I think that those of us that were there made a very strong case for it's all very well thinking that the way that we produce food is part of the problem, it's also part of the solution, and therefore we need to be on the inside when we're talking about those things. One thing that was really encouraging was the presence of the topic of water. So I've long had the belief that water is the elephant in the room, because we talk about climate and we perhaps talk about droughts and floods, but we don't talk about the fact that biodiversity loss is a greater risk from lack of water, or too much water, too little water in the wrong place. And life on Earth would not be possible without water. And we really don't understand enough about that. So things like the Water Pavilion, things like the Fair Water Declaration that was led by Lord Zach Goldsmith, all of those things I think really cause for optimism. And if anyone's interested in learning more, a quick plug for my old employer, Sainsbury's. We did produce, in combination with PwC, a water report for COP26, and I would thoroughly recommend having a look at that for the water system globally and UK in its entirety. Third area that, again, the food system didn't really feature in, and where I think we are really, really key, is what I would describe as the race to resilience. And this is what is going to happen to the smallholder farmers and growers, of which there are 500 million globally, smallholder households that are farming less than 5 acres, earning less than $2 a day, and who provide 35% of our global commodities: tea, coffee, cocoa, bananas, palm oil, sugar, things that we just take for granted. And this isn't just about providing the trillions of dollars that are needed to protect those environments. It is about re-engineering and reconfiguring those supply chains, because from my perspective, sustainable trade is part of the answer for those communities. And historically, they've been hard to reach communities, and they can't be in the future. The fourth area, and this is the serious elephant in the room, is data and reporting. So we talk about mandatory reporting, but mandatory reporting is meaningless without data standards and data methodologies and protocols, and they're not in place. So we talk about these numbers as if they are fact, and they aren't necessarily fact. They may be in some circumstances. In other circumstances, it may be modeled data, it may be reported data, and quite often it's not even data at all. It's what's euphemistically called metrics, which don't feature any numbers or any kind of data standards. And until we solve that, we certainly can't really talk about this with any confidence. So we've got a 6th carbon budget in this country, but we don't have the data to understand whether we are managing to hit that budget, underperform, outperform. It's all a bit of a opaque art at the moment. And then the 5th area for me, which there was some talk about at COP, but I think, again, something that is underestimated is the power of technology and digital technologies more broadly. Whether that is the Earth observation technologies that can tell us that we're fishing the world's oceans unsustainably, or we're deforesting areas, or whether that's the Earth observation technologies that can calculate the biomass of the trees underneath the canopy. All of those things really helpful. But the real power for me as a retailer is the fact that those technologies help us to connect customers to where their foods, where their products are coming from, in a way that goes way beyond certification or any paper-based auditing systems, because they can be real-time or as near real-time as we want them to be. They can see what's happening in the middle of the Indian Ocean or in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest. There is no hiding place from these technologies. And basically, they enable us to move from certification to verification. And we need to be dealing in verification. And I suppose to end my 5 minutes, to say that, you know, fundamentally, I feel optimistic, because all the talk at COP was about regeneration, restoration, and what we need to do. So we have moved on from talking about avoiding the bad things to talking about what we're doing to create a net positive situation. So a bit of a mixed bag on COP26, but lots of things to get our teeth into as a sector. And I, for one, are looking forward to working on those things. So thank you for inviting me again to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Judith. I'm sure there are more than 5 things that you could have talked about, so thank you for picking those. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those in the questions. Audience, please don't forget that you can post your questions as we're going. You don't need to wait for all of the speakers to say their piece. Next up, we have Dr. Christian Reynolds. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just thought I would share my screen to keep me on time and on track. I'm no near as organised as Judith, who introduced this so well, and I was nodding throughout that saying, dang, she's taken all of my speaking points. So thank you, Judith. So I think I'll lay in straight and say this, on the 6th of November 2021, away into the COP, was the first time, to my knowledge, that food was actually mentioned in one of the big plenaries, which was Jürgen Vogelen from the World Bank Directorate saying food needs to be on the negotiators' table. And that was the first time I'd actually heard it at one of the major events on the stage, actually somebody saying, we've not talked about food for 5 days. Where the heck has it been? And that was my experience of COP. And COP left me slightly terrified, if I can be open, and I'm probably a bit more of the depressed people on the panel about the result of COP. So if I go back a few steps and say that food and climate, to me, have always been linked. Human crop production and human activity on the planet have always influenced the temperature, and our food system has been built to respond to changes in temperature. And over the last, say, 800 years, there's been, from the 1300s to 1800s, a thing called the Little Ice Age, or a little cooling, which has basically meant that our food system and Europe's food system has been built on a cycle of responding to cooler threats up to a maximum of 0.5 degrees cooling. However, what's now terrifying is that we're moving towards a trajectory for 1.5 to 2 degrees warming. So the policies, our infrastructure, the type of crops we grow, all of this has been built in terms of thinking about resiliency, as Judith just said, for a cooling food system. What we're now needing to re-engage with is thinking about resiliency for a warming food system, which to me is something we've only just started doing at COP, is actually saying, how can we make our climate change policies also about our food system, and how we can make our food system policies about climate change, changing how that linkage works. So there's this brilliant report by WRI a couple of years ago looking at the actions we'll need to hit a 2 degree or 1.5 degree target. And for me, it's these bits in the red that are the things myself as an academic and us in the food system, we can control in our middle part of it. A lot of these other sorts of things are in R&D and technology and innovation, and also more downstream in terms of inputs into the food system. But here we've got shifting diets and reducing food loss and waste, and that's all data driven, as Judith said. So that was amazing. And we need to think about how we can actually change these different trends and policies to enable it to be a better, warmer system, and how long we have to implement these policies. The roadmap that came out at COP26 was very, very light on the timeline. And if we think about it in terms of, we've only got 7 or 8 years until 2030, when the SDGs are supposed to have been met. So what do we actually have by then, and what actions we need to put in place now? We have a lot of different guides, be it on food waste, be it on healthy, sustainable diets, that are highlighting no regret actions. So actions that help with health, help with food, help with climate. So there's lots of different lists out there. We need to start actually thinking about these all together. I will probably end there because I'm about at 4 minutes according to my watch. But again, it's just thinking around that we have the science and technology that can be used to empower and engage citizens, but at the same point, there are these different challenges there. So I'll stop sharing, and also just do a shout out in my last 30 seconds to a network called the STFC Food Network Plus that enables a lot of different science and research. If you're interested in that, please do get in contact afterwards around these different things. So thank you for letting us talk, but COP26, it is a terrifying thing, but we do have the capacities to change all that. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a slightly more sobering view. Thank you, Christian. Next up, we have Dr. Lucy Porter.
Hello, hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me today. And I think very much a similar theme for me. So picking up from Christian, I think I just wanted to highlight, obviously, what John Kerry said, which was that it was hard to overstate how critical agriculture and food sectors are to our global emission goals. So that kind of challenges what Christian said. And I think the science couldn't be clearer, because we know by the middle of the century, as Christian said, the world needs to reduce its emissions to be as close as zero as possible. So the science is screaming out for action. Obviously, given my role, that's where I write out and focus. Obviously, it's a priority. It's a huge priority. The agriculture and food system is a major priority for climate, both from a reducing emissions perspective, a nature perspective, and also preserving the perspective of strengthening adaptation and resilience. All those things are really critical for us to think about. I think COP, for me, highlighted this and how critical science and innovation in particular is integral to fighting those challenges that Christian so eloquently just set out, recognising the role of informing actions for everybody who's involved with the whole food system. Everyone has a role to play, and some of that was explained in the Glasgow Breakthrough in Agriculture Innovation, which is one of the many things that came out of COP. At COP also, there were also some global action agenda for innovation in agriculture, which was highlighted, and this was around driving investment to R&D and innovation to help tackle some of these challenges, along with various other policy action agendas and initiatives. And all of these are all pointing to really helping us think about how we can deliver a more sustainable and agriculture food system. So I guess in terms of from a government perspective, how are we limiting global warming meeting Paris Agreement? Obviously, DEFRA has a key role to play in that, particularly in delivering the government's net zero strategy, which came out last month, which sets out policies and proposals for decarbonising all the sectors in the UK economy to help meet those targets we've talked about. But there is no silver bullet to achieving our decarbonisation ambitions, and I can't stress this strongly enough. We need a range of measures or a range of interventions to achieve these goals. There's a lot to do here and we haven't got much time, and we need a system-wide approach to doing it. So some of the things just quickly to touch on from a DEFRA perspective, the sort of things we're doing are thinking about future schemes to reward the delivery of environmental benefits, and some of you will be familiar with that, such as the ELM scheme, and how we can encourage the adoption of soil management practices, for example. And then there are other activities include the Environment Act, which recently got royal assent. Obviously that's going to have a key role to play. And then just touching on the forthcoming food strategy, which is in response to the Henry Dimbleby review, which came out about 5 months ago. This will again provide another opportunity to help us achieve our net zero nature and biodiversity commitments, and think about how we do that and how we deliver for people, nature and the planet. And then just to briefly, just moving on to the science. In the UK, we do have renowned strengths in science and cutting edge technology and agriculture and food area, and the government is committed to driving that forward and understanding how we can help address some of these goals. And we've already made significant investments in agri-innovation, as Judith will remember, and those are continuing. So in a nutshell, there's a lot of things I think we are doing, and I'm happy to pick up some of the questions on some of the science space as we move forward. But the bottom line is we need a food system approach, and there's no silver bullet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy, and apologies for misintroducing you there as the excuse me, stand-up comedian Lucy Porter. Clearly not who you are. Okay, so thank you. Next up we have Andrew, who is going to, I suppose, give us the perspective from the manufacturing side of the sector.
Thanks, Gavin. One of the advantages of going lower down in the pecking order is that I'm able to say with absolute sincerity and gratitude that a lot of what I was going to say has been said before. But actually, and I'm not wanting to prejudge what Tom is going to say, but the fact that we're all thinking in similar ways, Judith, ex-retail, me, processor, Lucy, government, Christian, researcher, and hopefully Tom, farmer, we're all, I think, coming at this from a very similar perspective. I noted that the panelists were not allowed to vote in the poll. Had I voted, I would have ticked the disappointing box. I think that, and I didn't have the benefit of being there, from outside and from the public reporting, food really didn't get the attention it deserves. We all know the headline priorities were coal, cars, cash, and trees. Now, coal and cars, you can actually phase out or eliminate, depending on the terminology, but you can do without internal combustion engines, you can do without coal. You cannot do without food. Food is part, does obviously contribute both to emissions and also to environmental degradation if not done properly, but we have to have it. And most food production, in fact, all food production, whether animal or plant, is all part of carbon cycles and nutrient cycles. Basically, all food is a variant of photosynthesis. It's changing the sun's energy into usable energy for human beings, either through the medium of plants or through the medium of animals. And those have to be cultivated or nurtured in some form. They have to be turned into products. They have to be distributed, particularly for growing urban populations. We're well past, for the majority of the world's population, we're well past subsistence farming and local communities. I think over half of the world's populations now live in cities. So you've got a whole complex of issues around distribution, processing, and so on. And again, in an increasingly climate challenged world, things like shelf life storage are going to be very important as well, because fresh food deteriorates quite quickly. You need to give it that additional shelf life, and also for resilience. If you're flooded, if your power is cut, you want some food that is actually going to be edible 2 or 3 weeks when you get back to relative normality. So it's very complicated. There are lots of different parts of that. I think my cause for optimism is that wherever we sit in the chain or outside it as commentators, I think there is a shared understanding. How we move from that to action is more of a challenge. I think, and I'm not alone in this was COP26. It's taken us 25 previous COPs to get to the point where some of these issues are overtly on the table. They may have been in the background up till now. How many more COPs it's going to take us before we move to action, I don't know. But one of the gloomier forecasts that I saw, and this may be relevant to Tom, where he sits in his part of the world, we may only have 30 more harvests in East Anglia. And I think that's quite a sobering reflection. So, we haven't necessarily got to 2050, 2060, 2070. Really, a lot of this has to be front loaded. And I think the big challenge, my 2 final points, is, if you look at, and Christian will know this, you look at the long-term real food prices, it's gone down and down and down for about the last 200 years. For most people, and obviously there's inequalities, there's poverty, but for the majority of people, food has never been as cheap. That has to change, not simply putting prices up for the sake of putting prices up, but one of the reasons it's so cheap is the externalities in the jargon of food production are not costed into the price of the product, whether that's deforestation, whether that's water, whether that's carbon emissions, and so on. And my last point is, I think from a UK perspective, for all the ebullience of our political leaders, I think they paint a rather misleading picture of UK performance, because our carbon budget is around production, not consumption. And if you looked at our carbon budget on a consumption basis, it would look very different. And a lot of the carbon saving that we've already done was simply offshoring our old-fashioned heavy industries, steel, ships, coal, etc., to other parts of the world whose products we now import. So, and say I'm slightly on the pessimist side of the line, but I think cause for optimism that there is a shared understanding, and I think a genuine shared willingness across the whole of the food chain to move to what I think is now the urgent task of actually delivering this. But it's going to take real step changes in behavior and on the part of consumers. It's not something that manufacturers or farmers can fix on their own, and government has its part to play. So it's got to be a shared journey. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I'm looking forward to lots of stimulating questions and debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I'm probably in a similar place to you in terms of where I would put myself on the positive negative spectrum. And you've teed us up very well for the final panel speaker, Tom, who's going to talk from the perspective of a land manager, which is very much at the sharp end of the food system.
Thanks very much. Yes, the challenge of going last, of course, is that all the excellent points have already been made. So I'm going to try and make some points that haven't been made, but also underline some of the ones I do really agree with. I was disappointed. I went to COP. I was only there for 2 days, but I did go to COP, and I am disappointed. I think it's eye-opening to see how far from where I was expecting the discussion to be around food and agriculture to where it actually was. And in some ways, I can understand that, because as we've said, 70% of the global climate change problem is not food-based. It is about fossil fuels. And in the UK, it's even more than that. It's 90% of emissions come from the non-food sector. So that is the problem we need to tackle first. But as Judith mentioned, there is such an opportunity in the land-based and agricultural sectors to actually be part of the solution. And what I really found very frustrating was that to the extent that agriculture and the food sector was discussed, it was quite one-dimensional. It was really about meat, reducing meat. Now, I'm a plant-based farmer. I don't have livestock on my farm. And it really was surprising that I think a lot of the discussion it's a very easy thing for the general public and for consumers to latch onto. Something they can do in their lives is eat less meat. And that will somehow, make up for all the electricity and the petrol and everything else that we're using. So the lack of nuanced understanding about what the trade-offs are in some of these problems that we are going to be facing, I found disappointing, and the discussion needs to hurry up. So I have more hope that in COP27, some of those discussions will become more central to what we're talking about. I think you could put arguments for local effects of climate change and local responses to climate change will have to be different than the easy answers you can glean from a global picture. So in the UK, we have a lot of grass, and actually we might even, I think if you replace the global cattle herd with UK cows, which have a carbon footprint about 2.5 times below that of the global average, you would need a whole lot less cows, and actually that would create a global cooling effect. So we might even have to increase things like livestock production. And on my farm, which you can see behind me, which is arable, I'm actually looking to bring livestock back into the rotation in a way to replace some of the artificial nitrogen fertilizers I use in my fields, which actually have a massive carbon footprint. So yeah, the discussion needs to move on from just thinking about one thing about the food sector, and that's meat. The other thing, I think, there was quite a lot of discussion at COP about the developing world, and Judith mentioned smallholders, and that is an issue. And I think it underlines, it's easy to think about Africa or the Indian subcontinent, where you've got a lot of poor farmers with not very much resources. But I think that applies equally in what they started calling the global north. Farmers, as an economic factor of the supply chain, are the easiest part of that supply chain to squeeze. And that's what results in cheap food. And the technology and development helps those food prices come down. But it does that by reducing, putting the pressure onto farmers. And when farmers are put under pressure, they exploit the resources that they have under their control. And those resources are land resources. So cheap food equals an exploited environment, and that is the natural capital we are wearing down. The only way I see, and this is where I'm a bit more radical probably than a lot of other people in the NFU, is that only by increasing our economic power in that supply chain can we gain a fairer slice, a fairer reflection of our resources, and be able to afford to prioritize some of the other externalities and the costs which will come from farming in a different way. Generally, though, I think the NFU as a whole is more ambitious and optimistic than COP was, or even the UK government, because we have set a target that we believe that agriculture can get to net zero by 2040. And we have shown how we believe that can be the case. And a lot of it is taking opportunities to sequester carbon, which, where the land sector, all the plants behind me are all soaking up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and finding ways to store that and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, I think is a massive, fairly low-hanging fruit, and a massive opportunity for farmers if we can reap the benefits of it. So that's a bit longer than 5 minutes, but there you are.
Thanks, Tom. Consider yourself forgiven. Right, so thank you all for your introductions. Before we turn to some audience questions, is there anything that any of you would like to say in response to some of the other speakers who came after you? I'll take it that's a no. Okay, so we'll go to the audience questions, and we have a couple of them tied for most popular in terms of how these things stand at the moment. But I'll start with the question from Wayne Martindale, because it plays I suppose, fairly directly into what Tom has just talked about. Is stating that agri-food is responsible for 1/3 of GHG emissions correct, he asks. We hear it a lot. Is it global average? And this talks to Tom's point about the relative efficiency of livestock farming in parts of the world. Average of all kinds of enterprise, and the value of these top line views is surely limited. So Tom's farming will be different to almost every other farm. I suspect his operational emissions will be way below the 1/3, in inverted commas, of global average. Is stating that agri-food is responsible for the 1/3 just lending weight to critics who state we are responsible for biodiversity loss, etc.? So Wayne isn't just pitching this to Tom, it's for everybody in the panel, but we'll start with Tom's view, I guess, because it's closest to what you were talking about, Tom, in your introduction.
Yeah, well, I think that he's hitting off a point which I think I made, is that, you know, it's not the same everywhere, and the local responses to how this global problem we are going to be facing, I do think it's real, it's happening. It is going to be we're going to have an asymmetric response in different parts of the world, and it could be what we have to do here is very different. And what we're already doing here is, I said about the cows with a 2.5 times the carbon footprint of UK cows is 2.5 times below the global average. I mean, I don't want to get too obsessed about meat. I've criticized other people, but yeah, but that's the same here. But there are other trade-offs too. I mean, the land I'm farming here is mainly peat, and that emits carbon dioxide, but it's some of the most productive land that we've got in the whole of on the planet. So, you know, is re-wetting this field behind me going to actually improve or detract from our global contribution? Because where do we get the food from that we are growing quite efficiently if we don't grow it here? So this is what I mean by the trade-offs, and having a simplified, globalistic, averaged view will not actually come up with practical on-the-ground solutions which will make a difference, I think.
Thank you, Tom. Christian, some vigorous head nodding going on there. Do you want to come in next?
Thank you very much. Do you mind if I just share 2 diagrams which respond to the question? Because they're just probably the easiest way. So just very quickly, 2 different points here. Of course, never shares easily. So the first one here are 2 main assessments of recent different numbered top-down assessments of global greenhouse gases, both equating to between 28 to 34% global greenhouse gas, both using different data sets but coming to very similar things despite different system boundaries. So this is a slide I was using a couple of days ago, so hence why the other information on it. But you can see here in terms of where the big amounts are, one includes waste and cooking impacts, which again are, so that's at the top-down level. The other thing just to highlight here, and this speaks, I think, really well to that. It's different around the world, and the UK has really good farming land. And this is a graphic from a study from 2017-18, Poor and Nemechek, which basically, this is the range of carbon footprints for global production. And this graph doesn't get shown as much as its counterpart on our world in data, but it hammers home to me that the bottom 30%, the worst farms, so the ones at the top of the screen, the ones that are using there's these big tails, the worst 30% of farms, whatever your crop type, whatever your production, are responsible for around 60 to 80% of the emissions for that crop type. So that means addressing that bottom 30%, those worst performers, wherever they are, can have a massive systems benefit. And so Tom is exactly right. We need to be thinking about what we're farming in the UK and making sure it's the things that we have a competitive advantage over. But again, just showing that stark differences, because the UK is way down here in terms of beef and lamb. So we have those advantages. We have high welfare standards, but we have to have that discussion of, do we need to do more than produce for the UK? Do we need to be there for global consumption as well? Other voices need to be heard as well. I'll stop talking.
Christian, anybody else got anything to add on that?
Yeah.
Andrew? Oh, sorry, Judith, you were first. You have both hands, your virtual hand and your physical hand.
And a hand, yeah.
Both physical hands. So yeah, we'll let you come. Sorry, we'll let Judith come in first, then on to Andrew.
I was just going to say that, and I think from even within the UK, although in different sectors we know we perform relatively well, there's 2 points I'd like to make. The first point is that if you look even within the UK, and this is within the farming groups that I used to work with, where we used to measure carbon footprint with a carbon trust tool, you could see a five-fold difference, five-fold between the top 10% and the bottom 10%. So that just says if everyone just moved to the average, and you could move the average towards the top 10%, you would make a massive difference in the UK. That aside, the UK has reduced its food-related emissions, and that's agriculture, processing, so on, everything, by 8%. And that was between 2015 and 2019. However, that's because we are offshoring our food production to those countries that may not be producing food as efficiently. And then we're asking them to lower their emissions in line with our performance in lowering our food-related emissions. So it seems slightly ironic that we don't apply the same rules to ourselves as we apply to other people. So again, the thing we should be looking at is our food consumption, actual consumption, what people in this country are eating, and the emissions that are connected to the foods that they are eating, wherever they have come from in the world. And if you look at those numbers, we don't see the same kind of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we see when we look at our own food production system. And I think that makes you ask some really interesting questions about where our food is being produced and what we should be doing about that. Thank you.
Thank you. You can lower your virtual hand as well now. Okay, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks. I think we're going to be a very boring panel because we keep agreeing violently with each other. But just to build on some of those points, I mean, I totally agree with, if you raise the standards of the worst, whether it's the bottom 20, 30%, whatever, I would come back to a point I made earlier, that you can live without cars and coal. You have to eat. And I think it's slightly misleading when we talk about zero, net zero, absolute zero percentage. The impression is we are going to get to zero somehow, and that anything above zero is a failure. I don't think you can realistically ever get to zero for food. You can offset, but that's not the same thing. But what matters, and it's a point others have made, is comparative advantage, doing things to the best standards, and also in the physical locations that make most sense for that type of production to occur. The other thing, which I think is still very low-hanging fruit, is the whole thing, and Judith made the point around food waste. I think the figure is something like 30%. If you moved up everybody to the average, and you eliminated food waste, and you decarbonized the energy supply across the food chain, whether that's the fuel for tractors, whether that's the refrigeration and the machinery in processing plants, whether that's the lorries going to the supermarkets, the heating and lighting in the supermarkets, and so on. If you did all of that, you'd probably end up with something like a 70% or more reduction across the whole chain. And that wouldn't actually require huge change other than the decarbonizing of the energy source and changes in behavior. And most, I mean, I'm not excusing food manufacturers or indeed farmers from the food waste thing, but a lot of food waste is in the home. Some of it is on farm. That's and Judith will know this very well, it's partly an artifact of the way that orders are placed and timing and quality and nicely shaped fruit and vegetables and whatever. But the problem with food waste at the end of the chain is you've wasted all the resources in total that have gone up to the point where it is wasted, often including the packaging, which at the moment has got too much plastic. And the worst thing you can do is throw away a ready meal in its packaging after the use by date, because when it breaks down, you get all the methane, you've lost all the resources, and you get the double whammy of then the decomposition on top of that. So decarbonize energy, cut food waste, raise average levels of performance here and across the world. And I won't say you've solved the problem, but you've taken a mighty chunk out of it.
Thank you, Andrew. It's worth noting that in less developed economies, of course, much food waste does occur pre-market because the infrastructure is not there to support it. And Lucy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Just very, very quickly. I mean, I agree with a lot of what the panel was said, and I would just the only bit we've not touched on is the role of R&D and science in helping meeting these challenges, and that is absolutely going to be key. It's going to be vital to help us to understand how we can make these differences and understand how it's going to impact. And Judith picked up on the issue of metrics and how we need better data, we need better information, we need to work with others to produce it and have a really decent evidence base to build our thinking on. And I think it was Tom that mentioned about minimizing trade-offs and unintended consequences. We need a lot more evidence and data to support that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucy. And just to pick up on the fact, Andrew, you pointed out that you're all violently agreeing with each other. Not necessarily a bad thing, because it hopefully means that the people who are attending the webinar today or who might watch the recording on the website have a much clearer steer in what they could do in their organizations to make improvements. So I would say that's not necessarily bad. There may be no silver bullets, but perhaps we can give them several bronze bullets to put together.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's next question. The one that's bubbled up to the top now is from Rachel Ward. Data is the key to understanding which actions to take to have the greatest impact. So coming back to where we just ended with Lucy's comments there. How are we doing with defining, standardizing, and determining the necessary data to make those decisions? So we've all talked about why it matters. How close are we to being able to provide organizations with the right guidance? What should they be looking at, and what numbers can they trust? Who wants to take that first? Right, straight in there, Judith. Over to you.
It's my favourite topic. So we're hopeful that, and I'm not speaking for Lucy, but DEFRA understand the importance of this. And in fact, at COP26, DEFRA's Chief Scientific Advisor, Gideon Henderson, chaired a panel on this. And if you think about what needs to happen and what I would call the ecosystem that needs to work together to create great data and labeling, it is everybody from standard setters and policymakers in government through to something like the Office for National Statistics and how they report on the health of the nation, the health of our planet, and our progress towards net zero. So we had on the panel Karen Fisher from RAP, who has done a huge amount of work on Scope 3 emissions over the years. She really is an expert technician in this space. We had Alison Pritchard, the Deputy National Statistician from the Office for National Statistics, talking about her hopes for a richness of data that could help us understand whether we are hitting our targets, but also how the nation is feeding itself, well and sustainably. We had Chris Tyus, who many people have known from the Food Resilience Industry Forum that was set up in the wake of COVID and Brexit. And Chris is ex-Nestle, but he's also chair of GS1, which is the global barcode standard. And of course, the holy grail here would be if we could get that data into a barcode that could be scanned and shared with our sales data. So instead of just producing things like the retail price index, we could produce some really meaningful indices based on real sales data of what people are actually purchasing. And hopefully that's close enough to what they may be consuming. I know it's not exactly the same thing. So I think it's definitely on everyone's agenda, but it is a massive target because I said earlier, we import so much of what we eat. It needs to be a global standard, and getting people to compromise, getting people to actively collaborate on that is no small order, but it is possible. And we've done it on other things. And in fact, we've done it on the barcode standard and what goes into an international barcode on a product. So we are capable of doing it. But I would say people still don't understand. So even in that session, we had lots of people talking at cross purposes. And the way I try to bring it alive, and this might be helpful, is to look at nutrition information. So those of you can think back 30 years, we spent ages defining what fibre was. All sorts of different definitions of fibre, but we picked one. There are all sorts of ways of testing for that fibre in a lab, also different analytical methods. And again, we argued, and the numbers that came from that were quite different. But we argued about that for years. I remember it vividly. And we came up with one analytical methodology for testing for fibre. And then we created a database that was free for all. So you don't have to pay to access it. It's democratized, that information. And unless we have the same thing on climate, environment, biodiversity, water, whatever it might be, we are not going to get past go on this, because it can't be for those people who can only afford for somebody's labelling scheme to certify their data and charge them £500 a time for it. If we end up in that position, and there's a real danger in that because people see a commercial opportunity here, we will not get the level playing field we need. And all of those small producers, because at the end of the day, the big impact of the data is way upstream on the farm. All of that burden will be put onto the people who are less equipped to be able to supply that data, and that would be criminal. So speech over, but as you gather, I feel very strongly about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And before I hand over to Christian, who I'm sure is going to want to come in next, as you mentioned nutrition, I mentioned in the introduction how too many years I've been in the food industry, and many years involved procurement. I can't think of a single time I ever bought any nutrition. I've spent millions of pounds of my employer's money on the basis of size, shape, color, all sorts of cosmetic considerations, but I don't think I've ever had nutrition in a spec. So Christian, over to you.
I wish we could buy our nutrition, because it would be a fascinating thing. But I was going to originally talk about trade-offs between packaging and food waste, because I was going to respond to Andrew and a few others. But I'll just come in and say that this issue of data is core, and we have standardized databases now which are open access, but again, it's not for company specific value chains. We can do company specific value chains, but they're not there in terms of the open access that Judith is saying. So from a R&D perspective, we have this ability, and if you again check out the STFC Food Network Plus, we've been linking this data at geospatial, temporal, lots of different levels there, and looking at different aspects. Another thing that City University we've been involved with is creating a greenhouse gas database for 4,500 food products that is harmonized to Food-X2, which is the European Food Safety Authority's nutrition and safety database. So it means we have a value with best, worst case scenario greenhouse gas emissions, as well as mean and median. So so that's greenhouse gas, land, water, biodiversity, these different metrics. We have a peg that we can put in for 4,500 foods, which means most of the basket can be covered. At the moment, we're looking at converting that to recipes. So that means you can say for a spaghetti bolognese, this is your best case, worst case scenario. We're doing those sorts of things, but the trick is going to be saying, can an R&D team from a supermarket take this information and then backcast it onto their entire catalogue of SKUs, which means you can then get the labels. So you can either get a single label or an omni label or any of these other sorts of things. That's the next 12 months, I reckon. And by then, hopefully DEFRA and FSA will have also talked about the methodology they want to use for the carbon labels as well. But I'll stop talking now because there's a lot of other people on this call who have definitely great opinions about this.
Indeed, and I'm presuming you have to take regeneration method into account in that as well. Right, Tom, your hand is raised.
Remember to unmute. Yeah. Unfortunately, before I was a farmer, I was an economist and a management consultant. but what that did give to me was an appreciation of the systems which we work under. And I'm afraid that information and data about a product aren't going to be enough. The way that markets proxy information about a product is through price. And currently, environmentally friendly food, climate friendly food is more expensive than climate damaging food. So we need a change in the system that rewards climate friendly food with a lower price, because however much consumers want to help by buying the right things, if they have to be able to afford to do it for a start, but also when you're faced with a choice between a loaf of bread for £5, an artisan loaf of bread for £5, or cheap white for 50p, unfortunately, the cost of that product in terms of environmental damage is not reflected in the price, and people buy on price overwhelmingly. That's why the supermarkets have price wars. It's why food is so cheap. So we need a system where taxes, I think, can act as a proxy to alter the prices and value those elements of environmental resources which are put into the food, so that they are reflected in the price ticket.
Andrew, your hand was up, I think.
Yes, thanks, Gavin. I'm not disagreeing, but I wanted to qualify some of the things around data and metrics. I mean, they have a role to play, but I think we need to be a little bit careful. I mean, in an ideal world, you would look for measures that are a global level playing field and so on. But with the exception of things like carbon and methane, where a ton of carbon in the atmosphere is a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, wherever it comes from and from whatever production system, the value of a litre of water is not the same. The value of a litre of water in the Lake District is not the same as the value of a litre of water in India or Peru or wherever. So I think there is a sort of, there is a danger in trying to do some of those metrics, that you may get skewed results because of those different relative values. Another one is land use. If you are, if Tom goes over to putting cattle on, that's a land use change, but it's not one. He sees it as one that's beneficial. But obviously, if you're cutting down a forest to plant something, you've got a major land use change there, and you've got to be able to factor those sorts of things in as well. And then you get the even bigger challenge of how do you quantify and value biodiversity loss? And because that is also very important, because we talk about food systems. I mean, the food system in two different senses. It's the system that gets it from farm to plate, farm to fork, but it's also the ecosystem where all these things interact. And trying to put values on things, although that has a role, I think a lot of time and effort can get diverted into that. And I think we know where the big numbers are. And back to my previous point, that if you can chase down some of the big numbers, whether that's waste, whether that's decarbonising fossil fuel energy and so on, that may be a quicker route than spending a lot of time and energy fine-tuning different systems because again, without being disrespectful to my own members or Judith's former employers or whatever, it's a natural focus of businesses. They will work within the system. If they're asked to come up with better numbers than their competitor, they will do things to come up with better numbers than their competitor, but that may or may not be driving desirable change in the real world. It depends on how good that measurement system actually is. So I would just caution a little bit, and that I spent in a previous phase in my career, I spent 4 or 5 years working with the European Commission on product environmental footprinting. And they are still on that journey, and it's taken them 10 or 15 years and they're not there yet. And they were even more ambitious. They didn't just want things that enabled you to compare one food with another food. They wanted you to be able to compare food with a pot of paint, or dry cleaning, or building a building, or a whole range of other activities. And I think that way madness lies, personally.
Thank you, Andrew. And I guess it's probably also worth saying, sorry, before you come in, Judith, that where there is a system, people will look to gain that system for commercial advantage. Judith, quickly, before we turn to Lucy, just in case she has anything she wants to add.
Yeah, just to say that, just to build on Andrew's point, one of the things that the RAP team are working on is how much data is enough data. So you don't need to collect all the data that you think you need to collect to get to the 80%. And if we can work out what those data points are that create the 80%, then this becomes a much more slimmed down, streamlined process that enables the burden to be minimized, but also to make sure that we're just putting our efforts where the greatest impact is. So yeah, how much data is enough? That's the exam question.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Lucy, do you have an opinion on that? I'm sure you do. You're muted still, I'm afraid.
Just very briefly, because I think you've covered one of the points, but I think it's about having confidence in the data. I think that is going to be critical in terms of how we take this forward, and understanding how we use the data. So it's how we're going to use it, how do we have confidence in it, can we trust it? And I think all of those things are knotty questions, because as I've already said, you can always find numbers, you can always produce numbers, but are they the right ones? And I think there's something around that, and as others have touched on, I think something about how we standardize the usage of that.
Thank you. And before we go to the next question, you use the T word there. There's trust in the data associated with those who use the data. There's also trust in the system of the people who are at the end of the system. So do we think that we need to do more for consumers to trust what the system is producing and providing them? Anybody?
Yeah, we do need to provide them with data. And I think, to Tom's point, we have got to connect the customers we serve with the communities that we source from, with the kind of information that enables them to recognize and reward those food producers that are doing the right thing. And that is a combination of storytelling, communications, but also labeling. And that has to be a level playing field. And if we can do that, then we get past go. But if we don't get past go, there is no way that we can connect consumers with the producers that are doing the right things, and they will then not be able to recognize and reward them. And the CMAs work on, environmental claims and greenwashing. I could show you dozens of products that are out there now that are making very disingenuous claims about the nature and the way those products have been sourced. And all of that will undermine the good work that we're all trying to do. So we have to move fast on this, because it's already a bit like the Wild West out there.
So more resource for the Environment Agency, perhaps. Okay, anybody else, any more points on trust before we move on to the next audience question? Okay, well, the next one we have, which is it's bubbled to the top of the pile, is kind of an extension on that discussion around data and standards. And it's essentially a question around the relative places of standards and assurance schemes and so forth around validation and verification. Will certification schemes, will assurance, will there be a change in the market effectively in the way that these things are used, and will we move away from certification and towards standards, and are standards going to proliferate, or are standards going to merge and simplify? Anybody want to have a go at that one? Go on then, Judith. I think I saw a hand there.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can talk about the merge and simplify, but definitely it needs to happen. There is a massive convening and consolidation that needs to be done. But thing that happened at COP26, and that was the announcement of the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And you'll know that there are loads of reporting standards out there. There's the IIRC. I mean, you need a degree in acronyms to even follow it, because there are lots of them. You know, it's the Carbon Disclosure Standards Board. It is the Sustainability and Sustainable something Standards Board, SASB, can't even remember, International Integrated Reporting Council. They have all agreed to come together to create a global harmonized reporting standard for climate. And I think what will come with nature will follow very quickly. So I take heart from that. I take heart from some of the investor indices, so things like the World Benchmarking Alliance, that are pulling everything together to create a global standard that the G7 are going to sign up to around a sustainable food, and I think it's called Food and Agriculture Index, that investors will use to measure businesses, that consists of other indices. So that consolidation is happening in other parts of the system. It's not yet happening, as far as I'm aware, in our part of the system, and that's probably what needs to happen next. And we won't get past the data challenge unless we agree on a globally harmonized system. But others probably know more about that than I do. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's another question, another audience question, which actually talks about the risk of action in one part of the value chain being essentially at cross purposes with action elsewhere. So maybe we can cover that as well as we go. So does anybody want to come in on the subject of standards? And Tom, you've just, on you go.
Yeah, I think if we're waiting for a global standard to be agreed, we'll be waiting a long time. And as has already been pointed out, we don't have time. You know, even within the UK, you know, some supermarkets aren't, you know, keen to join in with Red Tractor, which is the sort of attempt to bring all the parties together to come with a common standard. And you look at things like mobile phone chargers or Android versus Apple. There's always a commercial advantage in having a separate standard if you can capture that. So I think, again, I would just go back. It comes back to price. If there's more reward for acting in a climate-friendly manner in food production, and if climate-friendly food has an advantage to the consumer in terms of price, and if the default is that you have to prove that your food is your product or your food is environmentally friendly to gain those advantages, then that does fall onto the supply chain, and it will fall onto farmers. But I mean, that I think is an economic driver, and I think that's going to have more progress and get further quicker than trying to agree regulatory standards with countries like Brazil, Australia, the US, Saudi Arabia. You know, I mean, it's if we learned anything from COP26, it's that you move at the speed of the slowest thing. The slowest partner that you're speaking with, and that can't be good enough. We have to create a dynamic system which recruits other people into it.
Thanks, Tom. Andrew, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Again, I agree with that. I think just on the global thing, trade, people have referred to trade, I mean, both in terms of maximizing comparative advantage, but we are seeing already, and I'm trying not to be too political with a capital P, but there is a risk that in the pursuit of trade deals, standards, whatever they are, may well get compromised. And I think we, you know, back to my point that, you know, if we can drive for some of the bigger numbers, but I think we do need to make sure that in doing trade deals, we are very mindful of these things. But again, I agree with Tom and his economics background coming to the fore here. I mean, price is a real driver. And the other point is that, again, this is picked up in the excellent Dimbleby National Food Strategy Review, some of these things around the correlation between low incomes and poor diet and health outcomes, because as a food representative of food processors, I'm not going to say there are good foods or bad foods. Some are healthier than others, some are more sustainable than others. But to your point, Gavin, that actually we mustn't lose sight of good nutrition in this. It's not just about climate impact, it's actually about giving people balanced, nutritious diets, both in the developed world and in the developing world. And we also run the risk of having parallel systems. We run the risk of having a set of environmental traffic lights alongside a set of nutritional traffic lights. And some will match, others won't match. And you're asking a lot of the consumer to do their own trade-off. We've had things like the Eat Well plate and then the Lancet thing that you're trying to bring together the environmental with the nutritional side of things. I'm looking a little bit in Lucy's direction here, because obviously DEFRA are reflecting on how they're going to respond to the Dimbleby report. But again, back to my earlier word of caution, I wouldn't want to get too driven by the labeling. It's a means of help of informing decisions, but it shouldn't become too rigid and too inflexible, and it shouldn't lead us to overlook the very big issues and some of the bigger transgressions. And again, not being political in naming names, but the Brazilian system has quite a bit to answer for in the way some of their food production is conducted. The same may be true, other polluters are available, but it's a very complex set of issues. And also, again, being a little bit political, in present economic circumstances, if government is actually faced with inflation, faced with some of the other things, trying to strive to prevent food price inflation from taking off, it might lean towards some of these trade deals and some of these things that might, dare I say, compromise some of the nobler ambitions in terms of improving environmental performance. That's as controversial as I'm going to get, I think.
I think we all understood what you're saying, Andrew. Judith, over to you.
Sorry, just to pick up on the point about standardization, and perhaps a better word is harmonization. I don't think there's any way in a million years you get the world to agree on standards, but what you can get the world to agree on is to benchmark those standards to a harmonized score. And I would take the Global Food Safety Initiative as a good example of that. So there are all sorts of food safety standards and audits and certifications around the world, depending on the sector, depending on the geography, Global GAP, BRC, so on and so forth. It is not our job to say what that standard is, because different things work for different sectors and in different geographies. However, there is a set of food safety standards that everyone would want to see in place. How those are delivered through the different standards owners and through the auditing and certifying bodies is fine. There are lots of ways of doing it, but the output of those standards is what matters. So when I'm talking about setting a global standard, it's the outputs of those standards that are important, not the standards. So the data that we put into the system needs to be agnostic to the standard, to the certification, just in the way that it is with organic, because there are lots of different organic standards bodies. And if we can create data that can be multi-purposed, then it doesn't really matter, as long as the standards are delivering the outcomes that we're looking for and the data that is going in is consistent. So I agree with Tom, there won't be. And besides which, every standard owner thinks their standard's the best. That's why they invented it. And that's why they audit against it and report on it and put their logo on things. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we're not going to change that. But we do need to be mindful that we need some kind of core consistency. And that's going to be even more important with the partners that we trade with closely in Europe, because as we have left the Union, those things are already starting to diverge and already. And if they start to diverge on some of these things around climate and nature, that would be a disaster. So yeah, harmonization rather than standardization of data, harmonization of standards. Yeah. You're on mute, Gavin.
You're right, so I am. We have 5 other audience questions to get to after this, so if you could be very brief. Christian first, then Tom, then Andrew.
I was just giving thumbs up. Please move on. I'm just, this is an amazing discussion. Don't let me hold it up.
No,
Tom,
I
it's
have
all
nothing,
yours.
nothing to say.
Okay, Andrew?
I was just signaling I couldn't hear you.
Yes,
so,
okay, right. So there I was thinking that. Okay, in that case, we'll move on to the next question, and I will not mute myself quite so quickly. First of all, thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. In terms of supply chain, how can importers and distributors of food products and ingredients to the manufacturing sector take action or be the agents for action? Those who are not involved in the production or the consumption, but are involved in the logistics. So anybody want to have a go at that? Go on, Andrew, please go ahead.
You're on mute.
I'll have a bit of a go at that because my association, we represent both manufacturers and people who are purely traders who are doing what the question suggests. But again, I think this is where the whole supply chain needs to join hands and decide what it's trying to achieve. I mean, in a narrow context, and again, we keep coming back to this thing of price. And Gavin, you've made the point of specification. What is the specification that those sources of the people sourcing those ingredients are working to? If it's a purely technical specification, functionality, it'll be that. It'll be price. It's probably not at the moment going to be what is the environmental impact, or indeed what is the opportunity cost were they to provide a different ingredient that may be slightly different functionality, slightly different price, but would lead to the better performance of the finished product. So I think this is an end-to-end thing. I think, you know, where, and particularly where you're looking at complex products that have got multiple ingredients, you know, there's a room for food technologists and nutritionists and so on to come in and say, actually, the specification should be this, not one that is driven by either price or some of the perceived characteristics. And again, you've got trade-offs with things like shelf life. Some of these things are designed to stabilize the product, increase shelf life as an end in itself. And that's a valid thing. I made that point earlier in talking about resilience and so on. You know, shelf life is important and it helps to reduce food waste. So you're back to the complexity there. But I think it's wrong to say, you know, to an individual trader or sourcer of ingredients, you've got it wrong, when they're working within an end-to-end system and they're not the autonomous decision maker in that. They're basically working to a specification that they have been given by somebody else. So that's not to exculpate them entirely, but to say you've got to view this in context of the whole supply chain, right the way through to the retailers and indeed customers, because I'm sure retailers will say we are only doing what our customers want us to do. So there is a shared journey on all this.
But maybe a position that there's a role for trade bodies to bring together the voices of the sectors which they represent.
I think there is a gap in the market for a collaborative forum. I think I saw in one of the questions, you know, I think, and again, looking towards Lucy, I mean, I don't know whose role it is to convene that sort of a forum, whether that should be industry-led, government-led. Ideally, it's got to be a partnership, I think, because part of that will be what regulatory frameworks government puts around that. and if there are standards and labeling systems, who mandates those, and so on. So I think there has to be that, and we've done that a little bit in response to crises. We've done it a little bit in response to COVID. We've done it a little bit in response to Brexit. I think we need to, and I'm hesitant to say we need to invent a new machinery, but I think we do need a new collaborative space where we can address these bigger picture climate change resource issues in a non-competitive way. And somebody needs to try to do that. And as I say, I think it's got to be a kind of a shared thing.
Maybe there's space for another product sustainability forum. Okay, Lucy, you were quick. Oh no, sorry, you go, Lucy, then Judith.
Very short one, yeah. Just from a personal perspective, to endorse what Andrew's saying about a collaborative approach, and it comes back to that point we talked about at the beginning about this is a food system and it's really complicated. You can't just tweak one bit because there'll be knock-on impacts elsewhere. So very much agree with the collaborative approach, and that everybody needs to work together. And obviously, as Andrew knows, DEFRA does have various groups of the industry where it's collaborating all the time. And as you mentioned, obviously we've been having those discussions are always happening and always ongoing. So yeah, very much support the collaborative point. Thanks.
Thank you. So well done. SDG 17 getting a shout out there. Judith, over to you.
I just wanted to come back to Andrew's point about retailers would, say that they only do what their customers want. And I don't think that's true, Andrew. I think retailers do a lot by stealth. Reformulation is a classic. And that's not just because we were forced to by reformulation targets. We've been reformulating products long before those targets came into being. And it's that whole thing about if customers knew what we know, what would they expect us to do? And what would a trusted business do? So I think there is a lot that goes on in the background. Most of that has been around health and nutrition, but some of the voluntary stuff has been around things like animal welfare, RSPCA assured, a lot of those standards that came out in the 90s and early 2000s were as a result of retailers and manufacturers working together to create those, things like the Marine Stewardship Council, for example. But I think when it comes to climate and the environment, we're in the same position, mainly because we don't know enough. So on many of these things, it was stuff that we really had a deep understanding of. And the food industry doesn't have a deep understanding of climate science and doesn't necessarily have a deep understanding of biodiversity and some of the challenges they're at, and certainly doesn't have a deep understanding around some of the challenges of water in our food system. So I think there is a massive upskilling that needs to happen. And I think you could go, and not to be controversial, but you could go and talk to a lot of food businesses in the UK and globally and say, we've got a new agriculture bill, we've got a new environment bill. Can you tell me the top 5 things in both of those bits of legislation and what they mean to your business? And I'd be really interested to know what the answer would be.
Thank you. Time is against us. We have only around 5 minutes left before we need to draw things to a close. We have about that many questions as well. Judith, did you just cover the one that you wanted to answer from that list of 5 and then that response? Thank you. So Tom, you've also volunteered to pick up the one about innovation and technology. So would you like to give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the question is how optimistic we are about the role of innovation and technological advances to help address the issues we're talking about. Yeah. And I think this is the big sort of elephant in the room, for want of a cliche. We have to feed 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, and we have to do it, and that involves producing more food from the earth than has ever been produced before up to this point. And we have to do it in a way that reduces or eliminates our climate impact and preserves the natural environment as much as possible too, for our own survival. So I don't see there's any way of going back in history, back to a system. There was no point that we've been in the past that can solve the problems we're in today we can learn from things in the past, but I think we need to find new ways to produce that food with lower impact. And the only way we can do that is through increased innovation. And that means trusting people on the ground like baby farmers, but also the scientists and the research. And I think that's an area where the UK stands potentially to make a really large contribution from our research community and from embracing the land sector as well. And I really want to see that. I would love to see that, to quote the phrase, turbocharged.
Lovely. Lucy, you want to add something to that, I think. You're still muted.
I do, and I thank Tom for raising it, because it's something I said at the beginning. Certainly, we really, from a DEF perspective, we recognise completely that innovation and R&D is integral, but we also recognise the fact that we've got really fantastic farmers, businesses, and the two things need to work together. So we need to connect the scientists and the experts with the industry, and that way we will then get the pull through of the science to actually fix things on the ground. That's what needs to happen. And obviously we're already starting to do that. There are various funding investments out already. There's the Transforming Food Production Programme that was set up in 2018 by UKRI, which is very much doing that. So it's rocket boosting, as you were saying, Tom, the innovation. So it's very much trying to do that. And then DEF was very recently launched the beginning of a new scheme again, which is industry-led, about driving innovation on farms. So I just wanted to really endorse what Tom was saying. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. And Christian, you've stuck your hand up for one of the remaining questions, which is the relative benefits of cow reduction versus waste reduction. But I thought you might also want, when you've addressed that one, to have a go at the question around offshoring and whether or not a different trade balance will have an impact on an emissions balance.
Thank you. I just replied quickly to the cow versus cow versus waste in the chat, because I didn't think we'd get to it.
That's fine.
But in terms of, there is a trade-off there. Dietary shifts are going to be bigger than waste, but we shouldn't be making it a sin, because there's a lot of things along the chain that are not because of anybody's fault, but things in the food system, as Judith, Helen, Lucy, everybody has been saying here. The big thing is, in terms of offshoring, is that it's a problem as we shift our diets as well, because where is our plant-based food coming from? It's coming from overseas. We need to change what's being grown here if we're wanting to move towards a plant-based diet as well. If you want to talk about any of this, I'm very happy to talk more in terms of offshoring. We have the different value chains to show you how water footprints work, or how carbon footprints work, where these different flows of grain, wheat, pulses are coming from. The data's there, it's just actually engaging with it. And I think that was what I was going to say to Andrew's point on what different people in the value chain should be asking, is keep asking questions up and down to see if these people actually have the data and understanding of how this is going to affect. Because I think we're always happy to talk about it, but it's also understanding that everybody may not have all the answers right now.
Lovely, thank you. Lucy, was your hand up for this, or was that okay? Right, so there's one last residual. It was expressed, I guess, more as a question, a statement rather than a question, which has to do with the economics of the industry, that people want to feed their families. People will buy the food that they can afford. This is sort of picking up on Tom's observation economics. We haven't really massively addressed the concept of the just transition. We have talked about making more emissions intensive foods more expensive, but that still means that there are people at the bottom of the economic pile who might have difficulty in accessing nutrition. Some people have the diets they have not through choice but through necessity. So does anybody have any closing thoughts in the last, I'm afraid, only 60 seconds on the subject of how we can ensure that nobody is left behind in this transition, nobody is disadvantaged?
Just very quickly, food poverty is poverty. And the era of cheap food is over. Food is only going to get more expensive all the way up to 2050. And actually that poverty needs to be addressed by different systems, not just the food system. Okay, I would agree with that. Christian?
Yeah, I would also, a few years back, I was on a commission that we started with the title Food Poverty, and we came to precisely the conclusion Tom came to: there isn't food poverty, there's poverty.
Absolutely. That where you feel that poverty is a matter almost of choice for the individual. Do you eat? Do you feed? Do you do whatever? I agree. And actually, I've done some work talking to people about SDG 2, suggesting that zero hunger is not the agri-food system's problem. It's a system of government and interventions. There is plenty enough food produced in the world because the population is still growing. It's a question of equality of access that is the issue, and that's for other interventions, I think. Well, thank you, Christian. Right, so we're at 13:28. I know that a number of you have to go to other things for 30:30. I say 13:28. I'm in a different country to you, so it's probably 12:28 where you are. Sorry for that. 30:30. I should have focused on the 30:30ness of it, not the 13ness of it. So thank you again all for your contributions. We just about managed to get our way through the questions that the audience provided. I thought it was a fascinating set of contributions. Good news, I think, in summary, that by and large, we all agree with the direction we need to go, which means that individual actions that are taken independently by individuals, organizations, trade bodies, whatever, are probably all going to broadly be in the right direction. Stronger if we work together, however. So thank you all again. As a virtual round of applause, I'm sure you can almost hear it now. Well, for all of you and also for our audience for joining us today. So in terms of closing comments, the recording we mentioned earlier on will be available for everybody who's attended today. The link will be emailed to you, and it's available will be available on the website. Before you log off, those of you who are attendees, this is going to close into a survey. So please take the couple of minutes that's required to complete that survey. So thank you again, not in the order I had them, but as they appear on my screen, to Lucy, Judith, Tom, Andrew, and Christian. And thank you to all of those of you who joined and asked questions particularly. And thank you to the IFST for putting it on. And that's a goodbye from me.